Picture the following. You are an experienced engineering consultant working on a project to dispose of hazardous waste from the aftermath of the Manhattan Project. You have previously worked on projects like this for the EPA before, which is why the Cotter Corporation, who currently owns the hazardous waste, hires you. This waste comes from one of the uranium processing facilities in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is then dropped into your hands in 1973. The site that you found to dump the waste into was West Lake Landfill, conveniently located around 15 miles from the city's industrial center and 3 miles from Coldwater Creek, which runs through the suburbs north of the city. You chose this spot to dispose of the hazardous waste. These events are better known as the West Lake Landfill incident, where in 1977 the site was recognized as dangerous because of the illegal dumping, and when surveys found that the waste is leaching into the ground, it prompted the EPA to register it as a Superfund site. As a potential contractor, the EPA does not yet know of your participation in the project, and since you have also worked for them in the past, they reach out and ask you to consult on their cleanup process. You decline the offer, stating that this would result in a conflict of interest. However, the question I'm going to explore in this video is, was it unethical for the engineer to agree to perform services to the industrial corporation under the facts without the prior consent of the EPA? The question was brought up by the Board of Ethical Review, acting under the National Society of Professional Engineers in 1991. The case they studied included the same details as the scenario explained earlier. Engineer helps federal agency with hazardous waste cleanup, then helps another company, and then the federal agency contacts him in the future asking to contract against said company, which creates a conflict of interest. The relevant concerns outlined in the Code of Ethics brought up by the board is as follows. Engineers shall act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. Engineers shall disclose all known or potential conflicts of interest that could influence or appear to influence their judgment or the quality of their services. Engineers shall not, without the consent of all interested parties, participate in or represent an adversary interest in connection with a specific project or proceeding in which the engineer has gained particular specialized knowledge on behalf of a former client or employer. Now, there is one piece of information outlined in the case that I find to be very important when answering the question of the video, because it defines what is contractually obligated, or lack thereof, by the engineer. Quote, under the contract with the federal agency, Engineer A agrees to provide basic consulting services along with an understanding that the federal agency may request additional services at a later date. Nothing is contained in the contract between Engineer A and the agency concerning other work for other clients. End quote. Now, one of the facts acknowledged by the board in this case is how finicky government contracts can be, as the government sets and protects policies for companies to follow. The facts relevant to this case make it so that the contract itself is vague when it comes to working for other clients after the contract ends. The ambiguity leads to a discussion not entirely related to the Code of Ethics, rather one of integrity and common sense. So ask yourself this. When leaving a job, would it be best to keep opportunities open or to burn bridges? With exception to a few cases, most would say to keep opportunities open because it is advantageous to oneself to have options that have the potential to help you in the future. As stated in the case, it is recognized by both the engineer and the agency that future work would be available, and given the reach that the government agencies have over the industry, it was probably in the best interest of the engineer to at least notify the government agency of his employment at the new company. However, when it comes to the moral requirements of the engineer and putting integrity at the forefront, it would be advisable to ask consent prior to working at a new company. The conclusion the Board of Ethics came to in this particular case is that, quote, it was unethical for the engineer to agree to perform services for the industrial corporation under the facts without prior consent of the federal agency, end quote. Given this engineer is probably a specialist in the waste cleanup industry, and he has worked on numerous projects related to the field in this scenario, this requirement would most likely mean he has to ask every time he wants to sign a contract. This can get a little tedious over a 30-year career and create time delays, which might provide a counter-argument to what the Board of Ethics recommends. Another point to consider is the bias of the Code of Ethics to benefit the employer. If this decision to require consent for most future endeavors because of the possibility of the future conflicts of interest with the federal agency that might occur, then it would significantly hinder the project that the engineer could work on, which has obvious downsides. Another reason I'd like to point out is that it is implied that the contract was completed before the time of his next employment, which, since it was not explicitly stated he could not work for other clients, means he would not be in the wrong for doing so. For these reasons, I disagree with the board's decision and do not think it would be unethical to work for the company without prior consent from the federal agency. All that being said, this case is difficult to interpret into one straight answer because it is decided by what you value more, employee rights or employer rights. The conclusion the Board of Ethics came to, being the engineer should have asked for consent prior to the new employment, is understandable. However, if you take an employee central mindset, this decision looks a little far-fetched for most related situations.